Berlin, February 1941. The marble corridors of the Air Ministry shimmered under cold fluorescent light as a faint cloud of cigar smoke hung above rows of polished boots and ironed uniforms. A winter wind howled faintly beyond the tall glass windows, but inside, warmth and arrogance filled the air. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarshal of the Luftwaffe, leaned back in his chair, his chest draped with medals that caught the golden light of the chandeliers. Before him, a report lay open, typed in precise English and stamped with the seal of the United States War Department. The words on the page were almost absurd. America plans to produce 50,000 aircraft in the coming year. Göring lifted the paper, squinting at it as if it were a joke from a comedian. He chuckled, the sound deep and derisive, then turned toward his generals. 50,000 planes? He said, shaking his head. The Americans can't even build 50,000 bicycles. The room erupted in laughter. Around the table, senior Luftwaffe officers grinned, tapping their fingers on maps marked with red and blue pins. Europe under the Reich's control, the Atlantic almost theirs. To them, America was a land of talkers, not fighters. A place of jazz music, motion pictures, and factories that made cars and refrigerators, not warplanes. The world's superpower of consumption, not construction. Göring puffed on his cigar, letting the ash fall over a map of Britain, as though dismissing the United States with a flick of his fingers. Let them dream, he said. Dreams don't fly. But across the Atlantic, the mood was entirely different. It was late evening in Washington, D.C., and President Franklin D. Roosevelt sat before a microphone in the White House, his voice crackling through millions of radios across the continent. "We must be the great arsenal of democracy," he declared in his calm, resolute tone. "We must supply our allies, and we must prepare to defend ourselves." His words carried across factory floors, small-town diners, and farmhouses buried under snow. Men stopped their work to listen. Women stirred soup slower, listening too. Roosevelt's fireside voice made one thing clear: America was not going to stay asleep. At the time, the United States military had fewer than 3,000 combat aircraft, many of them outdated biplanes and worn-out bombers from the 1930s. Airfields were scarce, and production capacity was tiny compared to the German war machine. Yet in Roosevelt's mind, the battle ahead would not just be fought in the skies or trenches. It would be fought in the foundries, on the assembly lines, and in the hearts of American workers. The target of 50,000 planes wasn't just a production goal. It was a declaration of will. Still, even in Washington, many thought it was impossible. Industry leaders whispered that the president was dreaming too big. Reporters mocked the idea as a political stunt. 50,000 planes? The U.S. had never built half that number in its entire aviation history. Steel was limited. Factories were still geared toward consumer goods. Skilled mechanics were few, and wartime materials were already being rationed to Britain. Roosevelt didn't flinch. "We will do it," he said, "because we must." In Detroit, a machinist named Henry Ford read the news and smiled. The same man who once revolutionized the automobile industry with his assembly line now looked at airplanes as the next challenge. In Seattle, at Boeing, engineers pored over blueprints of the B-17 Flying Fortress, a 4-engine heavy bomber still in testing. At Douglas in California, men and women in coveralls began reshaping metal sheets under the echo of hammer strikes. Sparks lit up the night. The early months were chaos. Mistakes, shortages, and confusion. But something was forming beneath the noise. Momentum. Meanwhile, back in Berlin, Göring's spies reported the first signs of American mobilization. He dismissed them. "They're amateurs," he said, waving his hand. "You cannot turn toy factories into aircraft plants." He didn't realize that those toy factories were soon to be part of a vast network of war production that would dwarf anything Germany had ever imagined. In March 1941, Roosevelt announced the Lend-Lease Act. America would begin supplying Britain, China, and the Soviet Union with weapons, ammunition, and aircraft. The gears began to turn faster. Small companies converted overnight. Refrigerator plants became fuselage assembly shops. Typewriter factories began building gun turrets. Every hammer blow echoed the same idea. The mockery in Berlin would be answered not with words, but with engines. On the ground, life was changing. Women joined the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Rosie the Riveter wasn't yet a poster. She was a reality before she became a symbol. Housewives, teachers, and nurses became welders, riveters, and mechanics. Across America, the sound of production filled the air like a new national anthem. The hiss of welding torches, the hum of conveyor belts, the rhythmic thud of presses shaping steel into wings. It wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, noisy, and dangerous. But every piece mattered. Still, few believed they could hit Roosevelt's number. The scale was beyond comprehension. It wasn't just the planes themselves, it was the engines, propellers, radios, tires, and bombs they needed. Each part required its own network of suppliers, transport routes, and labor. And every week, newspapers asked, "Where are the planes?" The laughter in Berlin continued. The Luftwaffe dominated Europe, sweeping the skies clean over Poland, France, and the Balkans. Göring's pilots boasted of their kill counts while American assembly lines struggled to produce even a few hundred aircraft per month. Then something began to shift. New factories rose across the Midwest like metallic cathedrals. The Ford Willow Run plant in Michigan, covering 67 acres, became the largest single factory in the world. It was capable of producing one complete B-24 bomber every hour. In Seattle, Boeing engineers worked day and night, refining production of the B-17 and designing new long-range bombers that could strike deep into enemy territory. North American aviation built the P-51 Mustangs, sleek, fast, and lethal, soon to be the scourge of German skies. The scale of American organization was staggering. Railroads were repurposed to move engines across the country. Highways were filled with truck convoys carrying wings, fuel tanks, and propeller blades. Civilian pilots volunteered to ferry new aircraft across the Atlantic. It was an army without uniforms, an army of builders. By the end of 1941, before Pearl Harbor even drew the United States fully into the war, production had already begun to surge. Roosevelt's target of 50,000 planes no longer looked like fantasy. It looked like destiny. Göring received new intelligence reports that stunned him. The Americans had mobilized more factory workers in a year than Germany had soldiers on the front. For the first time, the Reichsmarschall fell silent. But that silence was brief. The Reich's propaganda machine still mocked the Americans as slow, clumsy giants. Strong perhaps, but too late to matter. Yet, in the darkened skies of Europe, German pilots were starting to notice something. New planes, new formations, the metal thunder of engines that didn't sound like British Spitfires or Soviet Yak fighters. These were American machines, faster, stronger, endless in number. The laughter from that Berlin conference room in 1941 was fading into an uneasy quiet. What had begun as a joke was becoming a warning. America's vast industrial heart was beating louder with every passing day. The nation that Göring thought could not build 50,000 bicycles was preparing to flood the world with machines of war unlike anything seen before. The Luftwaffe still ruled the skies, for now, but the storm on the horizon was already forming. Because the joke was over. And soon, the world would hear the sound of 100,000 engines answering it. They laughed at 50,000. America built 100,000. From mockery to mechanical thunder. One man's joke became the world's turning point. The first wave of enthusiasm that swept through America in 1941 quickly gave way to a harsh reality. Dreams were easy, steel was not. The United States had declared that it would produce 50,000 aircraft, but the tools, the materials, and even the manpower to reach that figure simply didn't exist yet. In Detroit, Los Angeles, and Seattle, factories that had been making cars, radios, and washing machines stood half-converted, filled with confusion rather than progress. Engineers argued over blueprints that wouldn't fit together, mechanics ran out of rivets, and union leaders debated who would be allowed to operate new machines. The smell of oil and frustration filled the air. Everyone had been inspired by Roosevelt's promise, but no one had ever tried to turn an entire consumer economy into a war machine before. In those early months, the obstacles seemed endless. Steel was short, copper was rationed, and aluminum, the lifeblood of aircraft, was nearly impossible to obtain. Some small manufacturers were reduced to melting down pots and pans donated by families in scrap drives. Skilled labor was another problem. The nation's best mechanics and machinists had already enlisted or been drafted. The people left behind were farmers, clerks, and housewives. In the cavernous plants, supervisors found themselves teaching grandmothers how to read gauges and teenagers how to weld. The air was filled with the noise of drills, the clang of sheet metal, and the sound of mistakes being corrected one by one. Still, something remarkable began to happen. The American learning curve was steep but fast. Within months, training schools opened across the country. Men and women who had never handled a wrench learned the language of engines and hydraulics. In California, aircraft factories expanded day and night. At Lockheed, engineers developed training manuals that broke down the construction of a fighter plane into simple steps. Women in kerchiefs stood shoulder to shoulder with veterans of the auto industry, riveting aluminum panels that stretched as far as the eye could see. Each hammer strike became a beat in a national rhythm, the sound of determination replacing the doubt that had filled the press. Detroit, the capital of the automobile world, became something new entirely. Henry Ford, already in his 70s, refused to believe the skeptics who said mass-produced aircraft were impossible. "If you can build cars by the thousands," he said, "you can build bombers the same way." He ordered the construction of the Willow Run plant in Michigan, an enormous complex covering 67 acres of land, designed to assemble the B-24 Liberator bomber. It was an audacious idea, a plane every hour, rolling off a line like a Model T. In the early days, it looked like madness. The first bombers came out late, incomplete, sometimes even unflyable. Mechanics slept on the floor between shifts, trying to keep up with impossible schedules. But the process improved. By 1943, Willow Run was building more bombers than all of Japan's aircraft factories combined. Elsewhere, General Motors, North American Aviation, and Douglas were learning similar lessons. The P-51 Mustang, born out of a desperate need for long-range escort fighters, went from drawing board to flight in less than 4 months. Engineers called it a miracle. Pilots later called it a guardian angel. It would one day escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something that had once seemed impossible. But before the victories came the setbacks. Fires broke out in crowded factories. In one case, an entire production line was destroyed overnight by a faulty oil pump. Workers wept in the parking lot, thinking the dream was over. In Washington, senators demanded to know why billions of dollars were being poured into plants that still couldn't meet deadlines. Roosevelt stayed firm. "Give them time," he said. "Give the workers faith. They will deliver." The war overseas grew darker. By the end of 1941, Europe was in flames, and after Pearl Harbor, the United States itself was thrust fully into the conflict. The demand for planes doubled overnight. Roosevelt now wanted not 50,000 but 60,000 aircraft per year. Many wondered if he had lost touch with reality. Yet the Japanese attack had changed everything. Now every rivet, every bolt, every worker knew the stakes. Fear became fuel. The government created the War Production Board to coordinate the industrial explosion. Companies that had never seen an airplane were told to make parts for them. Typewriter manufacturers built machine gun mounts. Piano makers produced propellers. Even toy companies began shaping small aluminum fittings used in cockpit instrumentation. This decentralized effort meant that pieces of a single aircraft might be produced in dozens of states before being assembled on one line. It was chaotic, but it worked. And then there were the women. They became the silent force behind the revolution. At first, management doubted them. Could they handle the heavy tools? Could they keep up with the pace? The answer came quickly. Women not only met the challenge, they exceeded it. Their precision and patience reduced error rates dramatically. Rosie the Riveter soon appeared on posters. Flexing her arm under the slogan, "We can do it," the image spread like wildfire, turning factory labor into a symbol of national pride. For the first time in history, women were the backbone of America's industrial power. Every day, across the country, freight trains thundered down the rails carrying engines, wings, and fuselages. The night sky glowed from the light of furnaces and welding arcs. The air smelled of hot oil and aluminum dust. Pilots fresh out of flight school ferried completed planes across the country to ports in New York, Miami, and San Francisco, where they were dismantled and shipped to Britain or the Pacific. By late 1942, the number of completed aircraft had risen to over 47,000, just shy of Roosevelt's once-ridiculed goal. The mockery from Berlin grew quieter. Inside the Luftwaffe's intelligence office, analysts were baffled. Reports indicated new American aircraft appearing in Britain faster than they could be counted. The scale of production made no sense. "It is impossible," one officer wrote. Göring refused to believe it. "Their numbers are exaggerated," he told his staff. "They are bluffing." But the photographs told another story. Rows of B-17 flying fortresses stretching across British airfields, like metallic fields of wheat ready for harvest. Back in the United States, the cost of this miracle was enormous. Workers collapsed from exhaustion. Families were separated as men went to war and women worked double shifts. Cities strained under the weight of migration as millions moved for jobs. Yet despite the fatigue, there was a growing sense of unity, a feeling that every citizen was part of something vast and righteous. Factory foremen began posting maps showing where their planes were flying, which missions they had survived, and which crews had sent letters of thanks. Each machine was more than metal. It was a life preserver for soldiers and pilots thousands of miles away. In one famous letter read aloud on the floor of a Boeing plant, an American bomber crew wrote, "To the men and women who built this plane, she brought us home. You saved our lives." Tears rolled down the cheeks of workers who had never seen combat, realizing their fingerprints were on the wings of history. By 1943, the impossible goal had become the minimum standard. Roosevelt called for even greater output. "Build for victory," he said. "Build until the enemy cannot breathe." The workers responded. New techniques, faster assembly lines, and better logistics meant planes were now rolling out faster than the paint could dry. The dream had become unstoppable momentum. Across the ocean, German pilots began to notice a terrifying pattern. Every week, new formations appeared, different models, different insignias, endless numbers. What had been dismissed as an American fantasy was now materializing as a storm. Göring's laughter from 2 years earlier was a fading memory, replaced by anxious briefings about an enemy that seemed to have no limit. The transformation was complete. From scrap metal and skepticism, America had built the largest aircraft industry in human history. The sound of those engines would soon echo over Europe in ways the Reich could never have imagined. But as 1943 began, no one yet knew just how far this industrial miracle would go, or how much destruction it would unleash in return. The world was about to learn what happens when a nation mocked into action decides to answer with fire and steel. By mid-1943, the impossible had become routine. America was no longer struggling to build planes, it was flooding the world with them. The transformation of industry into an unstoppable engine of war had reached its climax. Every sunrise revealed new squadrons taking flight, and every sunset saw another convoy of aircraft leaving the assembly lines. The air above the continental United States thundered with the sound of test flights, while across the Atlantic, German radar screens began to light up with terrifying frequency. What Hermann Göring once mocked as fantasy had become a storm spreading across the skies of Europe. It began with a rumble, 1,000 bombers assembling over English airfields, their engines shaking the ground like approaching thunder. Pilots stood on the tarmac of RAF bases, shielding their eyes from the morning sun as B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators roared overhead. The air was thick with exhaust, sweat, and adrenaline. To the men watching below, it felt as if the entire sky had come alive. The mission boards showed names like Schweinfurt, Regensburg, Bremen, targets deep inside the heart of the Reich. No longer defensive, the Allies were on the offensive, and the arsenal of democracy had given them wings. From Berlin, Göring watched in disbelief as reports streamed in. Allied bombers were coming not in dozens, but in hundreds, then thousands. German interceptors scrambled daily, but their numbers dwindled. The Luftwaffe had once been the terror of the skies, a symbol of Nazi dominance. Now it was being drowned beneath an ocean of aluminum and fire. A single American factory could build more aircraft in 1 month than Germany could in an entire year. Göring's once proud air fleet was being torn apart not only by bullets but by mathematics. In Detroit, Boeing, and North American aviation, the statistics had become their own kind of warfare. Every 60 minutes, a new bomber rolled off the line. Every hour, 30 engines came to life. At its peak, American factories produced an average of 7,000 aircraft per month. Fighters, bombers, trainers, and transports. Workers barely stopped to breathe. The din inside the plants was overwhelming. The hiss of welding torches, the growl of cranes, and the constant beat of rivet guns. A metallic rhythm that seemed to pulse in time with the nation's heartbeat. In the skies, the results were devastating. Over Europe, massive formations of B-17s cruised at 25,000 feet, their silver bodies gleaming like a wall of mirrors. The Germans called them Himmelsfestung, heavenly fortresses, because they seemed indestructible. Each bomber carried 10 men and 13 heavy machine guns. German pilots would attack in waves, but the defensive fire from hundreds of bombers turned the sky into a hurricane of lead. Even when planes fell, more took their place the next day. For every loss, America built 5 more. The industrial miracle had erased the concept of scarcity. The psychological effect was just as important as the physical. In cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Essen, air raid sirens became part of daily life. Civilians huddled in bunkers as wave after wave of bombers darkened the sun. Firestorms tore through the streets, and the night skies glowed orange for miles. The Luftwaffe, once feared, now fought from desperation. Short on fuel, short on pilots, short on everything but pride, they scrambled whatever they could. Göring's once boastful speeches had vanished. In their place were frantic orders to preserve what little strength remained. Meanwhile, new aircraft designs poured from American drafting tables. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin booms and deadly precision, began escorting bombers deeper into Europe. Then came the P-51 Mustang, powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a perfect marriage of British design and American production. It could fly from England to Berlin and back without refueling. The day it entered combat, the tide truly turned. German pilots, exhausted and outnumbered, found themselves hunted even over their own territory. On the ground, the numbers were beyond comprehension. By late 1943, the United States had produced nearly 86,000 aircraft. By the end of 1944, over 96,000. Factories in California alone built more planes than the entire Axis combined. Roosevelt called it the miracle of production. But for the Germans, it was a nightmare of arithmetic. Their intelligence reports grew grim. One note captured after the war read simply, "They build planes faster than we can count them." The Americans, for their part, viewed it not as pride but as necessity. To them, every engine, every wing was another step toward ending the war sooner. Soldiers fighting in Italy or the Pacific began to notice the shift. Supply lines no longer starved. Air cover became constant. Allied armies moved forward under an umbrella of American air power that seemed endless. Then came June 6, 1944, D-Day. The greatest armada in history crossed the English Channel, and above it, the sky belonged to America. Over 13,000 aircraft filled the air that morning. Fighters, bombers, transports, and gliders. The roar was deafening. The sky a patchwork of contrails stretching from horizon to horizon. German soldiers on the beaches looked up and saw not a few squadrons, but an entire civilization in flight. The industrial miracle had become a living storm. From his bunker outside Berlin, Göring reportedly muttered to an aide, "If I see one more formation, I'll shoot myself." He wasn't joking anymore. The Luftwaffe was shattered, its fuel reserves nearly gone. Pilots with weeks of training were thrown into combat against veterans flying superior machines. In a single week, Germany lost nearly half its remaining fighters. The sky, once its domain, now belonged to the very nation Göring had laughed at 3 years earlier. In America, newspapers carried photos of vast airfields in Britain, showing endless rows of planes stretching beyond sight. Arsenal of democracy reigns in the sky, read one headline. Roosevelt addressed the nation again. We will outbuild, outfly, and outlast tyranny. For the workers who had labored through sleepless nights, those words were vindication. They had turned ridicule into thunder, mockery into might. Even within Germany, civilians could see the shift. The once precise German war machine was choking under the weight of Allied bombing. Factories lay in ruins. Rail lines twisted into molten wreckage. Power plants and refineries were shattered. American bombers didn't just attack military targets. They struck at the lifeline of the Reich itself. Oil, steel, transportation. Every explosion meant fewer tanks, fewer planes, fewer bullets. For the first time, Hitler's generals began to admit the truth in private. The war was being lost not only on the battlefield but in the factories. Germany had no answer for the American scale of production. One historian later wrote, "The Reich was defeated not by superior strategy, but by superior supply. It was a victory of mechanics and morale, of people who believed that a nation united by purpose could outbuild an empire ruled by fear." The statistics told a story beyond imagination. Between 1940 and 1945, the United States produced 300,000 aircraft, fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, more than any nation in history. At its peak, an airplane rolled out every 5 minutes, 24 hours a day. Göring's original disbelief had aged into legend. His joke about bicycles was now quoted with bitter irony. The nation he mocked had created a storm of engines that erased his air force from the sky. By late 1944, Allied air superiority was absolute. German pilots described the horror of looking up and seeing the horizon filled with contrails from incoming formations. It was like watching a steel sky descend, one survivor said. The war in the air was no longer a contest, it was an occupation. Yet amid the triumph, there was awe. The sheer sight of those formations, the endless waves of aircraft glinting in sunlight, left even their creators speechless. America had not only built machines, it had built a symbol of human will. A people once dismissed as dreamers had become the architects of an industrial miracle that reshaped the world. The laughter in Berlin was gone, replaced by the silence of defeat and the rumble of bombers overhead. Göring, once so proud, could only watch as his Luftwaffe crumbled beneath the weight of American production. The tide had turned completely, and the thunder of 100,000 engines now echoed the rise of a new superpower. The storm that began in the factories of Detroit and the fields of Kansas now stretched across oceans. The world had entered the age of industrial warfare, and for the first time in history, victory was measured not by courage alone, but by the power to build faster than anyone could destroy. The thunder faded slowly. By the spring of 1945, the roar of engines that once filled the skies above Europe had become an echo of victory. The Luftwaffe was gone, the Reich was in ruins, and the factories of Germany stood silent amid the rubble. The war that had begun with arrogance and laughter in Berlin had ended in smoke, ash, and surrender. For the United States, the achievement was unprecedented. More than 300,000 aircraft built in less than 5 years. The mockery of Hermann Göring's 1941 remark about 50,000 bicycles had turned into the greatest industrial miracle the modern world had ever seen. But as peace returned, the question lingered, what would such power mean in a world that would never again be the same? When the war finally ended, American pilots flew their bombers home across the Atlantic. The journey back was bittersweet. The same machines that had carried them through fire and flak now hummed in peace, their gun barrels covered, their bomb bays empty. From the cockpit windows, pilots saw the ocean glimmer below and thought of the men who hadn't made it back. Out of every 100 airmen who flew daylight missions over Europe, 50 never returned. The price of industrial victory had been paid in blood and steel alike. In the Arizona desert, thousands of aircraft were parked wing to wing under the blazing sun. B-17s, B-24s, P-38s, and Mustangs, all once symbols of unstoppable might, were lined up like silent ghosts of war. Their aluminum skins gleamed under a clear blue sky, waiting for orders that would never come. Within months, many would be scrapped for metal, melted down to become refrigerators, cars, or bridges. A new chapter of American life was beginning built, literally, on the remains of warplanes. At the same time, America's factories did not simply close their doors. The men and women who had learned to weld, rivet, and assemble machines with superhuman speed had changed the country forever. Rosie the Riveter returned home, but she never forgot the sound of engines testing overhead. Henry Ford's Willow Run stopped producing bombers and returned to automobiles, but its methods and its workers carried forward a new standard of efficiency. Boeing, Douglas, and North American aviation evolved into peacetime giants, leading the dawn of the jet age. The airplane, once a weapon of survival, was becoming a messenger of commerce and connection. Yet, beneath the celebration, a quiet unease took hold among some of the men who had built this machine of machines. America's wartime economy had proven that any dream could be made real through production, but it had also proven that technology could magnify destruction beyond imagination. The mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 were born from the same industrial miracle that had produced 100,000 aircraft. Humanity had learned how to command nature itself, but not yet how to command its own impulses. President Roosevelt did not live to see the full victory he had willed into existence. In April 1945, as Allied troops closed in on Berlin, he died in Warm Springs, Georgia. For millions of Americans, it felt as if the guiding voice of the war had gone silent. But his legacy lived on in the assembly lines, in the belief that unity and effort could reshape destiny. "We have won the war with production," he had said before his death. "But we must now win the peace with wisdom." It became both prophecy and warning. Across the Atlantic, Hermann Göring, once the lord of the Luftwaffe, was now a prisoner awaiting judgment at Nuremberg. During interrogation, Allied officers reminded him of his 1941 joke. He stared at them, bloated and broken, and said nothing. The irony was unbearable. The same man who had laughed at the idea of American factories producing 50,000 airplanes now sat defeated by an army of workers he had never considered soldiers. The war had not been lost in the skies alone. It had been lost in the workshops of Detroit, Seattle, and Los Angeles. Back home, Americans began to grasp the true scale of what they had done. From 1940 to 1945, the United States produced more planes than Britain, the Soviet Union, and Germany combined. Each state had contributed. Alabama built fuselages, Ohio cast engines, California forged wings. The arsenal of democracy had been not a slogan, but a living organism spread across the continent. When the numbers were finally tallied, the total exceeded 300,000 aircraft and 700,000 engines, an achievement that redefined the boundaries of human industry. But the victory carried a hidden consequence. The massive war infrastructure could not simply disappear. Aircraft companies turned to new contracts for the U.S. Air Force and Navy, governments invested in atomic research, and a new term quietly entered the national vocabulary: the military-industrial complex. America had learned that power was no longer just measured in armies or fleets, but in factories and technologies. The blueprint of World War II would guide every conflict that followed, from Korea to Vietnam to the Cold War arms race. The laughter of 1941 had given birth to an empire of production that would shape the next century. For ordinary Americans, the years that followed were filled with both pride and reflection. Veterans returned home to a nation unscarred by invasion but changed by victory. The GI Bill opened the doors to college, new homes, and new jobs. Children who had watched their parents build bombers now played in the front seats of new family cars. The war's energy had spilled into the peacetime economy, fueling the prosperity of the 1950s. Yet every time a newspaper ran a story about new jet bombers or missiles, older Americans remembered Roosevelt's call for 50,000 planes, and the hum of factories that had once united the nation against tyranny. In museums and memorials, the story was preserved. Visitors to the Smithsonian stood beneath a B-17 hanging from the ceiling, its wings casting a long shadow across the floor. The plaque beneath it read, "Built by the hands of ordinary Americans who believed they could do the impossible." School children looked up in wonder. Few could imagine that this same machine had once flown through flak-filled skies, part of an armada born from a single boast halfway around the world. The irony remained sharp. Hermann Göring's mockery had not just underestimated American industry, It had misunderstood the character of the American people. When challenged, they didn't argue, they built. When mocked, they didn't respond with words. They responded with engines. The factories of the 1940s had been temples of teamwork and belief, uniting the nation in purpose. It was that unity, more than any machine, that had won the war. Still, some voices warned that the same unity could one day be turned toward darker goals. Philosopher and veteran Dwight Eisenhower, who would later become president, cautioned that America must guard against the very machine it had created. In the councils of government, he said, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by the military-industrial complex. The lesson of 1941 to 1945 was double-edged. Human creativity could save civilization or end it. In the quiet deserts of Arizona, where the sun still glints off the rusting hulks of forgotten bombers, that lesson lives on. Rows of aircraft stretch toward the horizon, their faded insignias barely visible under layers of dust. A boy walks among them, his father explaining that these once ruled the sky. The child runs his hand along a wing marked with the faint letters USAF and asks, "They built all of these?" The father nods. Yes, they built them when the world needed them most. The wind whistles softly through the empty cockpits. It carries the faint echo of the past, the laughter that once dismissed a dream, the roar that answered it, and the silence that followed victory. The story of those 100,000 planes is not only about war. It is about belief, courage, and the human ability to turn insult into action. History has its patterns. Great powers rise not only by what they conquer, but by what they can create. And every era begins with someone, somewhere, saying, "It can't be done." America proved otherwise in 1945, and in doing so, changed the meaning of power forever. Hermann Göring's laughter died in a cell. America's engines carried on, shaping the world that came after. From the ashes of that arrogance emerged a new age of flight, industry, and innovation. The arsenal of democracy had built more than airplanes, it had built the future. And as we look to our own time, a question remains. When the next impossible challenge comes, when someone again laughs at a nation's ambition, who will have the courage, the unity, and the will to prove them wrong?